Hello, and welcome to ACR Journals on Air podcast. I'm your host, Vicky Shanmugam. Raynaud's phenomenon is one of the most common disease manifestations of scleroderma. It causes a significant impact on our patients with pain, emotional distress, and avoidance of activities likely to trigger an attack. There are currently no FDA-approved treatments for Raynaud's because it has historically been very difficult to measure changes in patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials. The manuscript we will discuss today is Assessment of Systemic Sclerosis-Associated Raynaud's Phenomenon Questionnaire, Item Bank, and Short-Form Development. It was recently published in Arthritis Care and Research, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. I'm happy to be joined by the manuscript's senior author, Dr. John Pauling. Dr. Pauling is a consultant rheumatologist at North Bristol NHS Trust and honorary senior lecturer at the University of Bristol in England. During his PhD, he studied the role of platelets in microvascular dysfunction in Raynaud's phenomenon. He currently chairs the Scleroderma Clinical Trials Consortium Vascular Working Group, developing better methods for assessing peripheral microvascular function in systemic sclerosis. Welcome to the show, John.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. And it's great to be talking through this body of work that I have a number of people who I'm indebted to for actually getting the work completed. And it's been a program of research that's taken over 5 years. So great to see it finally published, and great to see it published in such a good journal.
Well, that gives me a fabulous lead-in because I wanted to start, John, if you don't mind, talking a little bit about how babies were made. So tell us a bit about this sort of background to how this study came to be. Every rheumatologist sees patients with Raynaud's, but we know vasodilators have some efficacy. How is it possible that there are no approved medications for this phenomenon?
Yeah, as you say, we're fortunate in the field of Raynaud's that we can have the opportunity to borrow lots of medications from the field of cardiovascular health sciences, which we know will promote vasodilatation, and we hope and anticipate these treatments will be effective for our patients. And often when we use these drugs in clinical practice and say to patients, do you feel this has helped your Raynaud's? They're able to tell us that they are effective. But we've really struggled to demonstrate that in clinical trial setting. And one of the things I learned early on through my affiliation with the Scleroderma Clinical Trials Consortium was that lots of rheumatologists and scleroderma investigators in particular also had concerns about the ability to demonstrate treatment efficacy using the clinical trial endpoints that we've been using for the last 25 years. And so this really gave me confidence and justification to embark on a piece of work to try and develop a new patient-reported outcome instrument for assessing Raynaud's. And the development of PRO instruments has become a science in its own right, and I was able to benefit from all of the best practice and FDA guidance approaches that set out about how to develop a PRO instrument effectively, and hopefully we've achieved that with the ASRAP questionnaire.
So tell us a little bit about the Scleroderma Clinical Trials Consortium, because they are a unique organization. They really focus on supporting projects designed to improve clinical trial outcomes for scleroderma research. I know you've held several leadership positions in SCTC. Can you tell us about the organization, how you became a member, and how SCTC supports clinical trial design for patients with scleroderma?
Yeah, the SCTC, as you say, its principal role is to bring together both scleroderma investigators who can support each other through clinical trial collaboration, and also industry and investigator-initiated projects, really to push the field forward in terms of new treatments for scleroderma through effective clinical trials. And a lot of the work of the SCTC does look at existing outcome measures, clinical trial design, in an attempt to make sure that we measure and assess systemic sclerosis manifestations effectively in clinical trials. And as I say, create new treatments or bring new treatments through to the clinic for our patients. So my own affiliation with the SCTC started about 10 years ago. I was towards the latter stages of my doctoral fellowship, And I'd heard about this organization. I went to my first AGM, the annual general meeting, which was always held at the ACR meeting. And I didn't know anyone in the room other than a couple of the scleroderma investigators based in the UK. But I quickly learned it was a very welcoming organization. And actually, when I expressed my interest to look more closely and critically appraise clinical trial outcomes for Raynaud's phenomenon in scleroderma, I was encouraged to set up a working group, which is one of the really thriving initiatives of the SCTC. And it's an initiative which really encourages participation of early career investigators. And so I ended up chairing the SCTC Vascular Working Group. And then through my affiliation with the organization on that and getting to know more people, I was encouraged to join the executive committee and served for 4 years as the secretary of the SCTC. And I still have a role within the SCTC co-chairing the Industry Roundtable initiative, whereby clinical trialists and scleroderma investigators from around the world collaborate and meet and have open discussion with industry representatives, again, to really try and achieve our mission to develop better clinical trials in scleroderma and bring new treatments for our patients where they're desperately needed.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And they've done amazing work in the field of scleroderma. I should mention that SCTC and the US Department of Defense partly funded the work that you present in this manuscript. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the performance of previous patient-reported outcome measures for Raynaud's phenomenon and why you needed to do this work. Why was a new PRO needed?
So 30 years ago or more, when investigators got together and planned clinical trials, often the outcome measures we developed for those clinical trials were designed by a group of investigators around the table, and we dreamt up as clinicians what we felt was the most appropriate thing to measure in a clinical trial setting. So when it came to Raynaud's phenomenon, what was developed was something called the Raynaud's Condition Score Diary, whereby we prospectively ask our patients to keep a diary of the number of attacks of Raynaud's they have and how long those attacks last, and then give themselves a score at the end of the day to indicate how severe and impactful their Raynaud's symptoms have been over the preceding 24 hours. And this is collected over a 2-week period, and then we average the daily frequency of attacks, the average daily aggregate duration of attacks, and then the average Raynaud's condition score, which is this single item and numeric rating scale scoring the severity and impact of their symptoms. And I think if I'd have been sat around that table 30 years ago, I would have dreamt up something very similar. It aligns with a construct of Raynaud's phenomenon that makes sense to us as clinicians, and this concept of Raynaud's attacks. I think what we've learned over the last 30 years is, firstly, demonstrating net treatment efficacy in clinical trials has been very challenging using these clinical trial endpoints. And then also, when you speak to patients, and particularly when you give the patients the diary and say, I want you to collect this over the next 2 weeks, I found patients would often say to me, well, what is a Raynaud's attack? What do you want me to include as a Raynaud's attack? And then for the duration of attacks, they'd say, well, my attacks end when I do something to warm up my fingers, when I put my hands under a warm water tap, or whether I start using my heated hand warmers or put on a pair of gloves. So do you want me to not do that to see how long the attack was likely to last without me acting? And I didn't have any good answers for these, but I realized that we were capturing a very clinician-centric view of Raynaud's phenomenon, but the patient experience of living with Raynaud's phenomenon was quite different. And that really formed the basis of the new patient-reported outcome, which was very much grounded in what our patients' experiences of Raynaud's phenomenon were.
So the tool you developed, I think you've called it the ASRAP questionnaire, standing for the Assessment of Systemic Sclerosis Associated Raynaud's Phenomenon. So you uniquely actually engaged patients in the design and development of this tool, and you have an excellent graphic in the manuscript summarizing the themes and sub-themes of the patient experience in Raynaud's. Can you describe that for our listeners and help us understand some of the patient experience for Raynaud's?
So the blueprint we followed for developing the ASRAC questionnaire was an FDA guidance for industry document, which set out how to effectively develop a patient-reported outcome instrument. And the kind of a process described in this document very closely aligns with the OMA Act process for how to assess and validate patient-reported outcome instruments. And at the heart of this, you really need to understand, if it's a patient-reported outcome instrument you're developing, you really need to understand the lived experience, the patient experience of this condition. So we were qualitative or mixed methods research over about 2.5 years to really understand what it was that patients were experiencing when it came to Raynaud's symptoms. And we did focus on patients with systemic sclerosis. And one of the next things we definitely need to do is see whether or not this lived experience closely aligns with other forms of Raynaud's phenomenon. This one, the work we've done very much is focused on systemic sclerosis, which, as you know, is one of the most severe causes of Raynaud's phenomenon. So the figure you allude to in the paper sets out a kind of conceptual schematic, really, of the kind of different domains that constitute the patient lived experience of Raynaud's phenomenon. So at the heart of that figure is the physical symptoms of Raynaud's phenomenon. So we all use digital color changes to help us as clinicians diagnose Raynaud's phenomenon, but actually as physical symptoms of Raynaud's go, that's a fairly minor experience from a patient perspective. What we learned from our patients was that pain is, for many patients, the biggest symptom of Raynaud's phenomenon. And if patients don't experience pain, or often alongside pain, patients experience other sensory symptoms such as numbness, tingling, burning. They get digital color changes. Their fingers feel cold to touch. And all of these symptoms combined make it very difficult for patients to use their fingers effectively. And so impacts on functional ability. And this can impact on social participation, work participation, and quality of life. And often patients will take measures to manage their Raynaud's phenomenon that leads to cold avoidance. So they'll avoid participating in sport or going out with friends. Or if the weather's too severe, they just won't leave the house at all. And you can imagine, if you give these patients the Raynaud's condition score diary, they could easily score themselves 0 for the number of Raynaud's attacks, purely on account of the fact they've just avoided the cold all day.
Yeah.
And so we're hoping that really by understanding these kind of experiences, we can construct questions that really act, how often you're having to avoid going out to prevent your Raynaud's symptoms from being unmanageable. That type of example of how the new PRO instrument really captures this lived experience. In terms of other features of the lived experience, there was all the methods that or the measures that patients adopt to avoid and ameliorate attacks, some of which I've already alluded to, but also the emotional impact. Our existing clinical outcome measures hadn't captured the emotional distress associated with Raynaud's in terms of the emotional impact of pain, the embarrassment, the frustration and annoyance about not being able to use your hands as effectively as you could. And also the uncertainty for the future. Our patients, particularly with scleroderma, when their Raynaud's symptoms are severe, they begin to worry, does this mean my disease itself is worsening or more active? Am I going to develop digital ulcers? So there were all of these other feelings that Raynaud's symptoms were evoking in our patients that we really hadn't really looked at or interrogated previously.
Yeah, no, and I think that's so important. So in the development of this questionnaire, you conducted several iterative modifications to ensure that the wording was simple and understandable. And you undertook a linguistic evaluation using a calculator called SMOG, or the Simple Measure of Gobbledygook. And I'm chuckling a little bit, John, because I have to confess that I did not realize gobbledygook was a scientific term. But I looked it up, and it's a validated way to assess readability. So would you mind explaining the simple measure of gobbledygook to our listeners?
Yeah, so so I was amazed when I looked at what the SMOG calculator stood for. And but it's essential that, and again, as clinicians and investigators, when we write grants and we prepare patient facing literature, we try our best to put our wording in language that is easily readable and understood and lacks ambiguity. But it is so easy to stray above that. So the SMOG calculator, you put in the original wording of your item, which, as you say, we developed it with patients. All of our items, the wording of our items, we tried where possible to use wording that patients had used in the qualitative research we'd undertaken. And then there was lots of expert input to develop and refine those items. But our original item wording for item 21, to give you an example of how we use the SMOG calculator, was Raynaud's symptoms have interfered with my ability to go shopping. Now, the SMOG index would suggest that this has a readability age of 16 years. It has 2 polysyllabic words and 10 words in total. So by simplifying that down to Raynaud's symptoms have made it difficult when I have been shopping, the SMOG index drops to 13.8. So I'm not entirely sure about what the algorithm within the SMOG index is to lead to that readability score, but it's based on the number of words, the number of sentences. Certainly the number of polysyllabic words has a big impact on readability. So it just makes you think very carefully about the words you're using and how easy they are for people to read and understand.
Fabulous. I'm imagining your next questionnaire will be in the form of haiku, 17 syllables per question.
Yeah, it'd be a good way of doing it.
So to calibrate the ASRAP, you then designed a large multi-center study. Can you share with us how you set that study up? I know the design predated COVID, so back when the world was, I'll say, ordinary or less exciting. But even then, it was a really complex study enrolling many patients in several countries over 2 years. Tell us how the study was designed and then the challenges you experienced in execution.
So as you say, we undertook a multi-center international study. The reason we wanted the study to be international, we chose English-speaking nations, so it was based in the US and the UK. We wanted to go international for 2 reasons. One is we wanted to have as broad a geographic, ethnic, and cultural mix of patients included in the study. And then the second reason, we wanted to make sure that we enrolled patients into the study who experienced Raynaud's symptoms in places that had hot summers, like in Baltimore, places that had cold winters, like Pittsburgh, and places where it rained all year round, like England. So we wanted to. I think if we'd have validated this tool using a very small, narrow group of patients, it would have been a much poorer tool as a result of it. So we definitely benefited from the support of a large number of sites across 2 continents. The second reason we needed to do that was because we'd settled on a statistical analytical technique called item response theory and graded response modeling. And this work was led by Lan Yu, who's an associate professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. And she did all of her training in Penn State and developed an interest in advanced psychometric theories, and in particular item response theory and structural equation modeling. And this has become really the go-to method for developing patient-reported outcome instruments. And Lan worked on the NIH PROMIS bank of questionnaires, which adopted this analytical method to assess the items and to score and calibrate the NIH PROMIS questionnaires. And when we sat down with Lan and said, well, we want to develop this, or we've developed this new outcome instrument, we want to test it using your item response theory. She said, right, can you get me 1,000 patients? And I said, well, that's going to be a problem because, as you know, scleroderma is such a rare disease. And she said, we may be able to achieve the item response theory analysis with 500 patients. So we enrolled over 2 winters. We specifically chose winter because we didn't want seasonal variation impacting on the responses we were getting. So one of the big challenges we have with scleroderma Raynaud's is the symptoms do improve. They're not completely eradicated, but they improve dramatically during the summer months compared to the winter. So we wanted to try and remove that particular issue. And then in the second winter of enrollment, COVID arrived on the horizon. So we had every site up and running. We were recruiting over 50 patients a week, but we were about to all go into lockdown. And so we ended up having to curtail our enrollment at 420 subjects, of which we had complete ASRAP data for 404 subjects. And Lan was initially pessimistic as to whether or not we'd be able to apply this statistical modeling to this number of patients. But thankfully, actually, when we looked, it was a perfectly suitable sized cohort. And so we were able to undertake both the analysis, which led to the scoring and calibration of the instrument, and the development of the short form instrument, which formed the basis of the ACNR paper, but also then the psychometric testing of the instrument, the validation work, which validating a new instrument requires far fewer patients. So actually having 400 patients for the validation work really meant we were able to do an excellent job in terms of psychometric testing.
That makes a lot of sense. And you did this really complex analysis involving scree plots, eigenvalues, and factor loading, which may be gobbledygook to some of our listeners. So would you mind explaining a bit about how you analyze that data?
Yeah, so it was about a 6-step process to score and calibrate the instrument. And so the first aspect was factor analysis. So we split the group into 2 cohorts, completely randomly. So we had an exploratory factor analysis cohort and a confirmatory factor analysis cohort. The eigenvalues you refer to look at whether or not all of these items, when put together, all sit together and they're telling you something similar, whether they're all capturing the same construct. And actually, our eigenvalues suggested we could have had a 2-dimensional instrument. So we could have broken this down a bit like the SF-36 has a mental component score and a physical component score. Mm-hmm. We could have split the ASRAP questionnaire into different dimensions. And what was fascinating about this analysis and really gave me confidence in the data was Lan was not interested in what the items asked about. The actual item wording meant, or really didn't mean much to Lan. All she was interested in is how the items hung together from a statistical perspective. And when we did the factor analysis, it was clear that items 1 to 10 were all grouped together in one factor loading, and then items 11 to 17, I can't remember the exact numbers, were very much a distinct group. And the second band of items were all about the emotional impact of Raynaud's phenomenon. And so just using these analytical methods, she was able to perfectly dissect the physical symptoms of Raynaud's from the emotional ones, although these actually did hang together very effectively. The eigenvalue of 21 indicated there was a very strong indication of a single underlying trait. And we ended up agreeing that a 1-factor solution was probably going to be the most effective method for this patient-reported outcome. And the nice thing about having a unidimensional instrument is we know that even though there are questions asking about physical symptoms and other questions about emotional impact and others about adaptation methods, these questions are all strongly interlinked, and as say, capturing a single underlying trait, which is the severity and impact of Raynaud's phenomenon. So then the next step was the IRT, the item response theory graded response modeling. And in that, we looked at these alpha values, which tell us, or they give us an indication of, did the patients who are completing the questionnaire, were they able to separate their response options? So did all the patients group their response options on the high end or the low end, or there were no 1s and no 5s? And thankfully, at this stage, you have to start removing items that don't comply with these assumptions. So at that stage, we only had to remove a single item. And then the next one looked at the LD chi-square, which looks at redundancy. So we'd been we'd probably overdone the number of items within the provisional ASRAP questionnaire. We had 39 items, but we never anticipated that this would remain a 39 item questionnaire. But what we knew is that we had to include as many items as possible, because having undertaken the work, we couldn't go back and ask the patients to add another question in.
Yes.
So we asked questions about numbness, burning, tingling, but we were and hypersensitivity, but we were conscious that these all comprise these sensory symptoms of Raynaud's phenomenon. And sure enough, the LD chi-square values indicated that you didn't need to ask questions about every one of those sensory symptoms. And so we ended up choosing the item that performed best in terms of overall scoring. And then there were various other methods: model fit chi-square, differential item functioning, that all looked for poorly performing items, or items didn't fit within the model particularly strongly, or that were redundant with other items. And slowly but surely, we were able to cut back on the number of items in the final questionnaire. So we ended up in total removing a total of about 12 of the items in the final instrument were removed, and this gave us our long form questionnaire. And then, as a separate piece of work, we were able to develop a 10 item short form questionnaire, because we were conscious that even 27 items is a very long questionnaire for patients to complete, for example, in a clinical setting. So we ended up developing a short form questionnaire which could be more readily applied in registries and routine clinical practice.
In the study, you were able to validate both, is that right?
That's right. So in the study reports in ACR, it was really developing and demonstrating the statistical appropriateness of the two different forms, the long form and the short form. But then in the subsequent study, which we've published in Rheumatology, Oxford, we were able to demonstrate that both methods have very strong construct validity and repeatability. So it was a very long, laborious approach to the analysis, but a necessary approach to make sure that we really had a concise, informed, effective questionnaire. And really, I'm incredibly grateful to Lan and her expertise and the way she guided me and the scleroderma investigators who were part of this consortium through that process to understand how to effectively develop and test and score a new PRO instrument using these methods.
Yeah, such important work. And so does this mean that there are plans to use the ASRAP questionnaire in clinical trials for Raynaud's? Is it already being used in clinical trials?
It has already been used. So industry in particular have been very interested to monitoring the work we've been doing. The last thing industry want to undertake is a negative clinical trial of a promising vasodilator therapy. So I would say at this stage, it's a useful endpoint to use as part of an endpoint model. So I don't think we should completely abandon the methods we've used in the past. And I also mentioned the methods we've used in the past there has been positive p-values that have indicated treatment benefits, but they've been very modest. So it's being applied now in early clinical trials, but also there's been interest in using it in observational studies, registry analyses. So, and we're very supportive of people using ASRAP as part of their planned research into Raynaud's phenomenon.
Oh, that's really great to hear. I, at this point, want to change direction a little bit. I usually like to give our listeners a chance to get to know the person behind the paper. And so I wanted to ask John a few questions about your career. Starting with the big one, what made you pick rheumatology as a specialty? What took you to Bath originally? And then now I know you moved a year or so back to Bristol. What prompted that move?
Yeah, so rheumatology, I think I first got interested in that as an undergraduate, actually, when people first started to talk to me about the concept of autoimmunity, this idea that the body's immune system can turn on itself, I just found that absolutely fascinating. And as is often the case in medicine, you get enormously influenced by cases you come across. And I remember as an undergraduate meeting a lady with severe lupus and just being absolutely enthralled, as to what was going on and could she be treated and managed effectively. And so I kind of finished medical school knowing I wanted to do rheumatology. And then I moved to Bristol because of love, which is a good reason to move to Bristol. And I've always lived in Bristol. And my wife, who's also a doctor, she works here in Bristol. But I had an opportunity to go over to Bath on a 5-month contract to work in a rheumatology unit over in Bath. And it was one of those moves where the 5 months before I knew it became 17 years.
Wow.
And I just lots of good opportunities came along during my time there. So I started doing my clinical training there. And then I had an opportunity to do research there. And then after that, a new post was being developed, and I was successful in getting that post as a consultant. So I was a consultant there for 10 years. And then I think with COVID, it was an opportunity for lots of us to kind of reappraise what we were doing, why we were doing it. We all had an opportunity to work from home, and Bristol had been saying to me for a few years, you should come across and work with us. We've got a big unit here, lots of patients, lots of great opportunities at the University of Bristol. And so I picked up the phone and said, okay, well, how can we make this happen? So just over a year ago, I moved over to Bristol, and I've got a wonderful set of colleagues, and I'm setting up the scleroderma clinical and academic program now in Bristol. So it's been quite daunting and lots of work to do, but we're making progress and getting things set up, which has been great.
Oh, that's fabulous. I was so excited to hear about that move for you. It sounds really exciting. Take us back a little bit to your PhD. You completed a PhD studying the role of platelets in microvascular dysfunction, particularly in primary Raynaud's and then also in systemic sclerosis. Do you have any tips for our listeners considering a PhD? How did you select the topic? How did you find your PhD supervisor? And are there any things you wish you'd known before you got started?
So a bit like picking rheumatology, I decided I wanted to do research in systemic sclerosis after meeting a couple of really inspirational patients who I just felt that, I realized very early on that this was a disease that we were still watching the natural history of without really effectively disease modifying. I realized we were miles behind inflammatory arthritis in terms of our outcomes and treatments. So I read a really inspirational review article by Ariane Herrick in which she talked about platelets, which are absolutely packed full of chemicals that promote vasoconstriction. And she'd mentioned that platelets were a neglected area in the therapeutics of systemic sclerosis, Raynaud's, and people needed to look at this more closely. So I decided I'd be that person. And that was really how I got interested in the clinical outcome measures, because when I started looking at platelets and thinking, well, how will I develop a few assays to look at platelet function, and then I wanted to see how they associated with Raynaud's severity. And I was looking with different cameras like infrared thermography, laser contrast speckle imaging to look at digital perfusion. But then I wanted to also see whether Raynaud's symptoms, patient Raynaud's symptoms were associated with platelet dysfunction. And that was how I got interested in the PRO instruments and realized how much more work there was to be done. And a lot of my interest in the patient-reported outcome instruments came from finding that there were patients who had very poorly perfused fingers, very poor blood flow to the tips of their fingers, who the Raynaud's condition score diary suggested their Raynaud's symptoms weren't that bad. And I couldn't understand that discordance. So a lot of the work I've done over the last 10 years has really helped me understand how it is that the patient could not report a very high frequency and duration of Raynaud's attacks and yet still have very severe Raynaud's symptoms and very poor perfusion in their digits. And then, so the second part of the question was, what advice would you give to anyone keen to get involved in research to, and a junior investigator just starting out, I would definitely encourage them to pick an area that they're clinically passionate about. So I find it so much more easier to do research. There's a lot of work involved in conducting research, but if you're driven by a real passion for the patients who are affected by these conditions, I think it makes it a lot easier, and it's a very strong driver. I think all junior investigators need to have a degree of naivety, and I'm very naive. I tend to, burst into an idea and say, yes, I'll do this. And in fact, actually, when we were developing ASRAP, I sat down with Dinesh Khanna and said, I want to develop a new PRO instrument. And he said to me, this is a ton of work and it's going to take you 5 years. And it ended up taking us 6. So because of COVID. So, but that naivety is a useful personality trait for investigators to have, because it sometimes helps you to take the plunge before you really understand what it is you're embarking on, and then you're in too deep then, so you got to keep going. So and then I would, for any budding scleroderma investigators, I would encourage you to get involved in the SCTC as early as possible in your career, because it is a brilliant organization. I definitely wouldn't have achieved, and we wouldn't be speaking on this podcast today, had I not linked up with the SCTC and benefited from their working group structures and all the support they're willing to give junior investigators. So, and there's funding opportunities that come with that, and fantastic networking opportunities. So the big piece of advice would be to get involved in the SCTC, meet people, chat to people, find out what other people are interested in. You'll very quickly have a network of collaborators with which you can do great work.
You're obviously very busy. You have an incredibly active clinical practice, a busy family life. Do you have any tips for our listeners on deciding what to take on, and then also what to let go of or decide not to do?
Yeah, I think, again, you should definitely do anything that excites you or interests you or stimulates you. And I think I'm probably still learning as to, when to recognize that my bandwidth has been, utilized to the full, and stepping back from projects, so, but even then, you can support other people's projects, even if you're not actively involved in them, in different ways. And then, so I think it's a tricky one. I think an important piece of advice I often give is to new investigators is don't spend too much of your time looking over your shoulder or to left and right. Don't try and compare yourself with other people. Just get on with your own work. Make sure that the work you do is to a high caliber and that it's something you can be proud of and that you feel you've done a good job on. It is far more important than trying to do 10 projects badly. So
yeah, good advice. Just get started and see where it takes you. Yeah. So, John, thank you so much for sharing your work, sharing your insights into building a career in rheumatology. Having you on the show has been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person sometime soon, maybe at the upcoming ACR Convergence meeting.
Well, it would be great to catch up, and thank you again for inviting me to come along on the podcast today and talk with you.
Thanks also today go to the international research consortia like the Scleroderma Clinical Trials Consortium, which helps catalyze rheumatology research by fostering intellectual collaboration and provides opportunities for scientists worldwide to partner on challenges that impact success of research in our field. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow at AC Rheum on social media, email us at podcast@rheumatology.org, and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.